Hello and welcome everyone to today's Association for Manufacturing Excellence webinar titled Inject Continuous Improvement into Your Culture and DNA. I'm Tim Piotrowski, Marketing and Media Manager for AME, and I'll be your moderator. Today's presenter is David Bovis. David Bovis is an experienced organizational performance improvement consultant and director with over 25 years of experience. An industrial psychologist and expert in leadership development, he also serves as a leadership coach for individuals and teams. He helps boards achieve their goals, deliver culture change, develop and deploy strategy, and embed operational change sustainably. Bovis's expertise includes lean principles and practices and improving top and bottom line performance. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. You'll be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. You'll see that you're muted on your attendee panel on the right side of your screen. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into your question area in the attendee panel and click Submit. We'll review the questions at the end of today's presentation and answer as many as we can. When you log off today, please check your email inbox. It'll have an invite and link to fill out a short webinar attendee survey. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey today, as your feedback is very important to us to improve future webinars. And we'll be sending a recorded link for a webinar replay to each of you next week. And now I'm pleased to introduce David Bovis, who will present Inject Continuous Improvement into Your Culture and DNA. Take it away, David.
Thanks, Tim. Hi everybody. Tim's been gracious enough to cover this slide for me, but that says pretty much what he just said, and when you get the slide pack, it will give you something to refer back to if you're so inclined, but at least you can see who's talking to you today. So at the beginning, you've probably seen these set of bullet points on the advert for this webinar today. And I have to point out to begin with that this was pulled off of the 2-day masterclass that we're running in Holland at the moment, and I'm going to do my best to try and cover some of those points for you, but I'm not going to get through 2 days worth of material in 40 minutes. So, you know, what they say, miracles take a little longer. So what we will cover, though, is this the title, Injecting Continuous Improvement into Your Culture. And what I want to focus on is the brain, how it governs the pace of change, how to make the best use of it. I want to focus a little bit more on the psychology and the neuroscience, so I'll drop a few bits of that in along the way and hopefully make it all make a bit of sense for everybody listening. So let's look to begin with at our beliefs about the pace of change. I guess, people, if I could be in front of the audience, I'm sure I'd get people putting their hands up saying who believes change is slow, who believes change is fast, and you would all have different memories coming to mind. So I think if we think about the slow side of change to begin with, the difficult and painful side of change, we've been talking about lean, haven't we, for a long time, probably the last 20 odd years. And before that, it went under different banners, and we started off as total production system and total quality management and quality circles and just in time, and all these different names and brands came along to sort of try and reflect the way Westerners learned more about the way Japanese did stuff. And we've been doing that for 40 years and rebranding, and now we've got other spin-offs, and it's all taken its time. And I've been involved with this for 25 years, and the way I saw it evolve with Six Sigma coming in, and theory of constraints and all the other different methods and approaches, was that people were going into factories like the ones I worked in when I was an engineer all those years ago, a tool maker and then production engineer, and they were coming in with consultants, working with management teams and leadership teams, and they were putting you on training courses and delivering tools and techniques, and everybody around me. I remember the first time I ever went on any training ever for what was then called world-class manufacturing. The guys went, "Hey Dave, are you going off to be brainwashed in that Japanese stuff?" And I was a young guy. I was like really worried. What do they mean I'm going to be brainwashed? So I went away and thoroughly enjoyed 4 days of training for lean management, and covered all the tools, and it was fantastic because it made a lot of sense, and it told me a lot of the same things my dad had brought me up believing, because he was ex-army and an engineer. So for me, it wasn't so scary, but it said a lot to me that people framed it in terms of brainwashing. You know, it was this thing that seemed it was imposed, it was something to be scared of or made fun of. Um, and so it didn't really sort of stick, it didn't get itself into the culture. And I saw that approach being taken really for the first sort of 10 years. Um, of my experience in lean and or world-class manufacturing, and which became lean during that same period. So I moved on in my career, and I moved up the ladder and got involved in management and directorship and bits and pieces. And the pattern I saw was that those tools and techniques were trained first, and then people realized it wasn't really working. And they would say, you know what it is you need to use strategy. Sometimes people would mention Hoshin Kanri, but normally they would talk about balanced scorecard and EFQM models and STRAP from an accounting point of view, and different strategic models. Very few talked about Hoshin, to be honest, but it was there in the background somewhere. And the first tools and techniques set of consultants would get the blame. You know, people would say, oh, it's the consultant's fault, or it was the guy that employed them. Sometimes managers would get sacked as a result of lean tools and techniques training not really working. And then the same thing happened with the strategic consultants. You know, they would get the blame, and another managing director would go and be replaced. And I saw this happening over sort of 10, 12, 14 years. And this cycle of consultants coming in 3 to 5 years on site, training tools, strategy, 3 to 5, 6, 7 years on site, training strategy. And then the next evolution came along, and people said, do you know what it is? It's a culture problem. And Jack Welch was a big name in this time, because, you know, and it was all that culture, strategy for breakfast times, the sayings were coming out of the woodwork. And so there was this focus on culture. And what had happened is that and again, this is only my opinion, but as I saw it at the time, the rebranding from world-class manufacturing to lean to Six Sigma to agile and all the other different bits and pieces that spun off out of it and got associated to it and combined, they were just blamed for being wrong. But the changing name allowed them to come back into the new set of managers that had come along once the old projects had failed. And when people said we need a change in culture, people said, we've got a tool set that does that. And a new set of consultants came into a new management team and applied the same tools under a different banner, largely speaking. And it still didn't change culture. So that was the way I structured things in my mind, and the way I started to frame the world about what I'd seen over sort of 10 or 15 years first-hand experience in a number of different companies. And that reminds me of if you go back in history, there was a guy called Ignaz Semmelweis. I don't suppose it's a name many people know, but this guy was the guy that found out about childbed fever, and it was killing too many women in Geneva General Hospital. And there was an unfortunate event where he saw one of his colleagues get stabbed with the scalpel that had been used on the cadavers, on the dead bodies. And he had been going from the cadavers to the ward and from the cadavers to the ward, and couldn't understand why his area of this hospital had this massive death rate. But then when his colleague got stabbed with his scalpel by accident, and he died of very similar things, Ignaz Semmelweis sort of had this idea that perhaps something was being transferred from the dead bodies to the living, and that's what was killing them. And he came up with the idea of germ theory. And as the story goes, it took about another 50 to 80 years of, after his initial campaign, for the whole medical world to acknowledge that there was this idea that there was a different way of looking at this disease, and that there was these germs that could be transferred from cadavers to wards and increase the death rate. Now, the interesting thing about that, and why I'm telling the story, is that Ignaz Semmelweis was really dismissed out of hand by the medical fraternity because of this new concept, this new idea, this new way of looking at the world, and the new way of looking at germ theory and disease. And actually, he was incarcerated. He was tricked into going to a mental asylum, put in a straitjacket, and beaten so badly by the people that were trying to keep him there. Once he had realised the ruse, he was damaged in the scuffle, got gangrene, and died 2 weeks later. So, the founder of germ theory, the guy that changed everything for us and led to Petri dishes being used to create penicillin and all sorts of wonderful things, actually died locked up in a mental asylum. And it just goes to show when you've got I don't know, an industry, a set of people in the world that have got a fixed belief about something, it's incredibly hard to introduce something new and change that belief. So you've got this idea that there's this really, really slow way of change, of making change, and that changing culture in business is really slow. And changing anything to do in these institutions like the medical institution or the lean institution in the world is really slow. And then over the last 17 years or so, I've been studying the brain, the brain and mind, neuroscience and psychology. And I found that the transition that people can make in their brains is slow in some senses, but also that it can be really quick. So, and much quicker than we think. So let's have a look at what change might look like that could be quick. Okay, who believes in love at first sight? It's a change that comes really suddenly, doesn't it? It can happen really, really fast. You can just suddenly have a whole different worldview about somebody, perhaps somebody you've not even met before. And then if you say the wrong thing, you can get that review, that worldview to reverse as well. But one way or another, just saying something silly can see us go through another really big change. So let's have a look at these facts about the pace of change. You've got this whole history about change and organizational change and institutional change taking a long time. But then you've got this evidence from the brain that says that facts about the pace of change can be fast. So we say that some change is slow, and that kind of change is when we have to build new habits and acquire new skills. And the reason that's slow, let me explain with a little bit of the psychology and neuroscience I'll talk about. We've got to build new structures in our brain to be able to build new habits and skills. And it's quite a recent discovery, really. I mean, you can go back hundreds of years and talk about the guys that sort of first identified neurons in the brain. But really, we only got scientific proof that this principle of neurogenesis, this idea that we grow new neurons in our brain and our neurons in our brain change all the time to reflect the changing world around us, that was only really established in 2009 by Elizabeth Gould and from Princeton. And I mean, there's lots I can tell you about that. There's all sorts of really big, silly technical words like the bromodioxyuridine that she used to replace tritiated thymidine, and it gets really, really silly and technical. So I'll try and stay away from that, keep it as simple as I can. But what she did do is provide some data out of those studies that showed that there were these new cells being grown even, on death's door by adult human brains. And extrapolating that data suggests that even when because this was mapped on mouse brains, so all in principle adult mammalian brains, whether that's human or rodent or dog or monkey, they've all got this capacity to grow new neurons because we need to be able to change our brain because our world changes around us, and like I said, we have to reflect it. So taking this data and sort of working it backwards, it's only rough, but I worked it out that one of these mouse brains that was being mapped for 2 million neurons in the hippocampus, it took about 9 months to change. Well, it would take about 9 months to change all 2 million of these neurons that were present in this particular section of the hippocampus. And that was only when this mouse was taken out of an environment it had grown up in and placed in entirely novel conditions. So it's really takes a long time for the brain to reflect new sensory stimulus. Okay, that's the slow process. But some change, like we said, is quick. So how do we do that? Trigger desire, trigger fear. So this is emotional. This starts to show us a difference between what slow and fast changes in the brain. We use existing structures that are there, but the chemical mix changes. So, I mean, a really good example of this is a guy that wrote a fantastic book called Brain Rules, John Medina. Some of you may or may not have heard of him. He's a professor out in the States. He describes an event where he experienced a burglar standing over him in the middle of the night with the moonlight from the window glinting off the blade he was wielding. And how his approach to home security took on a completely different dimension within 24 hours. So he replayed that moment. He woke up to find the intruder, when this light glinting off the blade over and over in his mind, remembering details with such clarity. It really was impressive, because the brain had fixed this image in his mind really quickly, and he had changed his lifestyle was accordingly, very fast as well. And now I also remember the particular detail about the brain and the moonlight, about the knife and the moonlight glinting off of the blade, because the avid description also provoked an emotional response in me, like a fear-based response. So the key point to take from that and the previous picture is that regardless of the emotion being positive or negative, love breakup or violent invasion of your personal space, it's the chemical shift in your brain that accelerates the learning and memory forming process. So by default, that means it speeds up the neurogenesis process. The conclusion from all of that is, if you want someone to learn something fast that they want to go towards and adopt, which is psychological language, they better be scared out of their wits or really enjoying it. So we can't go around scaring people in business, although we can perhaps link that back to the idea of having a burning platform to jump off of. But really, the way we've got to think about it in terms of organisational change is whether people want to be involved, whether they're got this capacity to go towards the change that we're presenting them with, because the whole of our brain and the way it works is set up to oppose that if it's not something that people want. So in the studies that oh sorry, hang on, I've got a whirly wheel this in and my screen hasn't changed. Here we go. So in the studies, what we find is that we need to trigger desire and not trigger fear to get change to happen quickly. And I mentioned this a towards away from thing. This is deeply imprinted from very early years, development years in childhood. And it links into all sorts of different aspects of psychology. It's to do with threats to status and ego. They call it early imprinting, accidents, really, depending on how people are left with thinking about what's scary and what's not. But all of that features in the response that we get from our staff, our employees, our managers, us as leaders in different businesses, when we are thinking about trying to create conditions in which people can go towards something. So, this desire in this changing chemical state in the brain and avoiding any kind of fear trigger is absolutely crucial. And then there's also the other part of it, which is to create a sense of progress. And that comes in, there's so much I can tell you about that. Let me pick a couple of things just quickly. Lawrence and Noria wrote a fantastic book. I think it's called Driven. Professor Noria, Nitin Noria, is the dean at Harvard, I think, at the moment still. And it's a really good book. And it was all about motivation. And they dug right into the detail of psychology and brought this fantastic, simple model back out the other end of it, which is to drive, to bond, defend, learn, and acquire. And so all of the complexity of psychology can be put under those four banners. So if you want to bond, it's because we're a social animal. We want to be able to do things together and be approved of socially, that kind of thing. To learn, if we learn something new, we feel like we're making progress as well. To defend, we've got defense mechanisms and we want to make sure we're safe and we defend what we've already got and our position in life. And again, coming back to this towards, away from, and imprinted threats to status and ego. And then to acquire, obviously we want to be able to do well in the world and get more for ourselves and make ourselves happier, and have more things that we can use for our own benefit from an acquisition point of view. And all of that links into the release of dopamine in the brain and this simply called seeking mechanism, silly long technical name, called the dopaminergic mesolimbic pathway. But what it means is there's a pathway of neurons in the brain that responds to dopamine. Those kind of things really become important to know when we're setting goals and targets, because if we impose the goal, it's something new, so people go away from it. They reject it, they resist it through their defense mechanisms. If they can be included in setting the goal, then they go towards it, or might want to go towards it at least. And if it's something that they feel like they're making progress towards in relation to 4-drive theory, it releases dopamine. Dopamine is an opiate-based neurotransmitter, and it gives us a feel-good factor, same as getting, a hit from cocaine, same chemical principle. So we feel really good about ourselves if we're involved in setting goals that we believe in and want to go towards. And you can see why that starts to become very important in terms of goal setting. So all of these things, all of these brain mechanisms and psychology and neuroscience all feature in this idea of allowing people to feel like they're making progress and creating conditions as leaders in which people can feel like they're making progress. And not a lot of that features in the tools and techniques training, unfortunately. And a key part of that is, not defending the status quo. What we're trying to do is change and get people in a position to be comfortable with change. And again, people being comfortable with the unknown is also very much a psychological issue. So the summary is, given the right psychological, social, and physical conditions, surroundings, change can be very quick. So I think that, for now, that's enough about the considerations about the typical beliefs people hold about the rate of change. You can see it can get very complicated very quickly, and it's very difficult to talk at a webinar to a screen and not to people that you can get feedback from. So I hope that makes sense to a point. Let's move on to the next section. So, and think about our beliefs. So we're talking about beliefs, which from my point of view is an established neural wiring and firing pattern in your brain that has evolved through neurogenesis over time. So that's what I mean when I talk about beliefs. So we have beliefs about the rate of change. It can be slow or fast, and we've dug into that a bit. Now, what about our beliefs about lean? So for this bit, I have to mention Emil Van Est. Emil and I have been working closely recently. We've combined our materials to create this Culture in Action Masterclass, and this is delivered under the Lean Leadership banner that we're using. So you'll see on these slides the branding for Lean Leadership, but this also reflects Emil's thinking, having been the Dutch translator of the Toyota Kata book by Mike Rother for the last 10 years. So process thinking, what does it mean to think in terms of processes? If we have a good process, we get good results, right? Yeah, everybody knows that. That's it. It's cause and effect, almost problem solving, if you like. So if we want better results, we know that we have to go back and improve the processes, and that's the loop. That's almost the continuous improvement cycle, isn't it? It's plan, do, check, act. You can quite easily overlay on that slide. So we said it's a bit like root cause problem solving. What do we need to have in place if we want better processes? That's the obvious next question. So let's see. Okay, well, our proposition is, and again, not being able to get the feedback from you guys immediately, we would say that it's better employees. And when we say better, we mean not only employees that are capable, but employees that are motivated. We need someone to think, and that's the key word, think. You engage their brain about the existing process, and engage their brain about ways of making it better. So that someone involved in that thinking process to improve it all has to have skills, but they have to be capable. But they also need to have the right attitude, don't they? To be engaged, to try, to want to be motivated. That's something that's very much psychological. So in summary on that slide, if you have people who are capable and motivated to create, again, a mental process. You don't create anywhere other than in your brain first before you can move a bit of metal and create a new jig or a fixture. So if you want people that are capable and motivated to create the better processes to get the better results, there's this whole human factor side of it that needs to be considered, because motivation is not something that you can get to occur by writing a process or having a system to follow. So next normal question, if we're going to continue the root cause kind of approach, if you want better employees who are capable and motivated, what do you need? What comes next? Well, let's just step out of that process for a second and recognize that quote. It's a bit of a clue. There are a whole bunch of statistics out there that prove people join an organization and leave a boss. I'm sure many of the people, if not all of you on the call today, have heard that. So next obvious answer, you want better employees, you need better management. Okay, so it makes sense, doesn't it? It's you can't have managers who are not going to engage your staff. They're going to disengage your staff and drive them away, right? So what do you do if you want better management? You can see where this is going now. It's better leadership. Hey, surprise. So let's look at all of that another way. Okay. Oh, sorry, whirly wheel on my computer this end again. Here you go, catching up. So as we've said, we've spent 30 to 40 years changing processes to change the results in the West under various titles that precede and follow Lean, all of which are focused on the application of tools. And around 2009, after 6 years of research, Mike Roffer found out Toyota focuses on people. They build people before they build cars, right? Everyone knows that saying by now. So what Mike found out is that managers are the teachers. They don't outsource responsibility for education to third parties. They spend hours per day coaching to develop skills. So getting a manager to spend that much of their day helping others requires a particular mindset, yeah, and the culture that supports that mindset. You know, leaders have got to give managers the time to be training and coaching for 50% of their time to develop the skills in the capable employees, and they've got to be leading and managing in such a way that they're motivating those employees. So it's you can start to see how it all comes together. So what words do we use there for the way leaders approach things such that culture develops in a way that it can support the mindset managers need? Spirit, maybe. Beliefs. We've been talking about beliefs all day today, so it's so far. So you know, there's a word there that needs to be put in place to I like neuroscience and psychology, but you know, again, we can think of that in terms of the way the brain works, which people could use the word spirit or beliefs to describe. And really, what we're saying is, you know, this is the missing link. It's about the same that same order of events that I described earlier, which is tools first, strategy second, culture last, and then because so much time's gone by, come in and try and change the culture with tools again. That's not ever been good enough. So without taking anything away from Toyota Cat, because it's a fantastic thinking structure, it really is good. We can't detract from that at all. Mike's done a fantastic job with that. But we do have to recognise it's still dedicated to the pursuit of building new skills. So, and as we mentioned a while ago, that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort because it's all about brain change. As we've seen in the West for decades, like there's still no guarantee that the use of tools to develop processes will change the culture. You know, we've just got 40 years of evidence now that doesn't really work, not in the West at least. So this, I don't know, it's especially obvious when we consider culture pivots on the beliefs of leaders. So if we think of spirit, beliefs, neuroscience, the way the brain's mapped, what beliefs it holds, what wiring and firing patterns it's currently got established, that's what's making people act and react the way they do and use the language they use. So that's kind of some of the constituent parts of an emerging culture, a culture that comes from people acting together to try and, you know, achieve results. So, you know, we can look at that in terms of the imprinted worldview of what good looks like. The language they use, as I've just said, and I don't know, the degree to which they lead by example. And again, straight into brain stuff, you can talk about mirror neurons. You know, we're actually designed from a brain perspective to reflect each other. That's how babies learn. You know, they copy mum and dad or the significant carer or whatever environment they find themselves in. So, you know, and it's the same with leadership. You know, if we see leaders leading in a particular way, then we will reflect that. You know, leaders have got the responsibility to act in consistent ways that that support this continuous improvement culture and the mindset that managers need to take it forward. So, I mean, it seems to me that you can train tools and provide processes to follow all you like, and that's good. And there's of course there's reasons why that's the right approach in to address some firefighting issues and immediately just try and you know, pick the low-hanging fruit. And everybody says you do that as a consultant to run a pilot scheme, run a pilot cell, whatever you know do, and prove to leadership that this lean stuff's beneficial and can save money. And you know, again, if you've got sort of key issues, burning platform issues on the shop floor, and it is an operational issue, then of course that's the right thing to do. But up until now, I feel like it's been the only way we've been approaching it. And when we get to the idea of culture, it's gone back to tools again, and it just needs to be more. So you know, if you don't change the culture through the introduction of people development rather than tools application, then there's a whole social dynamic in which you're trying to apply these tools that doesn't support them. And I think that's really why, you know, we've struggled so far. So it's one of the key things we can change is the language, and that really, because the way language works in the brain, the way we frame the world through the use of language, we use language to describe everything we hold in our imagination. And it's obviously the only way that we can get our thoughts out of our brains through the environment and into somebody else's brain, and hope that they interpret the words we're using the same way as I am with you guys today, that in a way that makes sense to them, and that same sense making process in their brain is, you know, the same as in your brain. But so language can be really, really crucial in all of this. And I think if we keep talking around these issues too loosely, with words like motivation and empowerment and engagement, and, you know, a lot of it, I think it sounds like HR buzzword bingo, doesn't it? But if we kind of dig into what does it mean for a human being to be motivated, we can say, oh, it requires dopamine to be hitting the dopaminergic mesolimbic pathway, the seeking mechanism. To trigger that response, we need to include people to set goals. And you can really quickly start making some of the science very tangible and practical on the shop floor. But we can't have that conversation if people don't speak that language. So changing the language really will help change culture, and it will change leaders' beliefs. And if you can facilitate that, then you really can hit that missing link head on and start creating the conditions in which everybody else can perform at their best, from managers to frontline. So beliefs about leadership, you know, at the moment we're stuck with so much from the past. We've got, you can go back 100, 150 years post-industrial revolution, and get all the way up to sort of McGregor through trait theory, and XY theory and all that kind of stuff. Because you've got Adair and Hershey and Blanchard and Blake and Mouton and all the different models that come from this sort of leadership development theory point of view. But largely, you know, we kind of fit into these two camps, which is command and control. All employees are, you know, let you fill in the blank, idiots, whatever word you want to choose. But I know what to do. I'm the boss. I know when to do it. I know how to do it. It's my way or the highway. You know, it's that kind of attitude is on one end of the scale. And the opposite end of that scale is employees are professionals. You know what to do and when to do it and how to do it. I don't care about your problems. Just bring me results. It's that hands-off, you know, doesn't want to get involved kind of management. And the point being is, you know, I know it's much more complicated than that, but we haven't got much time today. So it's sort of summarizing that and making it very, very simple to say there's 100 years of management theory sort of pivoting on these two ideas. It doesn't really matter which side you're on. Neither works really well. That's the key. So there's got to be something more to the way we approach leadership, and that means we've got to change our beliefs about leadership. So if we have a look at what Toyota says about leadership, I mean, and again, this is my words, Emil's words. You know, we were thinking about this through and put this together put this presentation together the other day. So we kind of said, well, the attitude in Toyota is, look, I'm not going to tell you what to do and how to do it and when to do it, but equally, you're also not free to do whatever you want. You know, there's a certain way in which we want to do things around here. There's a process and there's some philosophy that sits behind it, and there's a belief system that sits behind our approach, and we want you to adopt that. And if you look at the Toyota Way 2001, which had an awful lot of effort put into creating it, you find these 5 key points. Bullet point 2 and 3 there, in the original Toyota Way 2001 are Kaizen and Genji Genbutsu. But we've just changed that for some simple language. So it's to challenge, to always strive to improve, which is the Kaizen bit, to be fact-based, which is going to Gemba, you know, and making sure you've got the facts, respect and teamwork. And Toyota says that's the basis. Those are the building blocks of a continuous improvement culture. So if we look at what we've just covered and link that to those 5 keywords, we can think about, what does it mean to challenge? Well, you know, we need to trigger a desire to do something differently. You know, we need to get people motivated. We need to challenge the status quo. Always striving to improve. You know, not defending the status quo, removing the fear so that people feel they can move forward and not hold on to what their brain's currently wired to feel comfortable with. Look at what's fact-based, going to Gemba. You know, creating progress. If you look at all of the visual management approaches to, PDCA cycles and feedback loops and all the kind of stuff that allows people to know where they're currently at in their state of production, and throughput monitoring boards and day by the hour profit and loss and all that kind of stuff, that's all about being fact-based at Gemba. But it also links into this capacity to trigger the right chemical release in the brain, and that can accelerate change. So respect and teamwork, again, coming back to not triggering fear. So hopefully you can see the same connections that I can see there, that if you look at the psychology and the neuroscience, the way the brain works and the way minds evolve out of brains, and some of the key things you need to be able to accelerate change rather than slow it down, because if you put people back in a very similar environment and you introduce new things to them, you can trigger a fear-based response that makes them go away from, and the rest of the prevailing conditions around them, the rest of the social dynamic around them and everything they're already used to, can reinforce their negative opinions about the work they do and the job they've got. So a lot of introducing new things can have the diametric opposite effect of making people change faster. It can actually slow change down massively and drag out timelines on change programs, and obviously you do that and you're going to really increase cost. So let's think of another example where change was fast. NUMMI, that was a pretty amazing example of change happening really quickly. I guess the history behind it. It was the worst performing General Motors plant. There was 3,000 employees there. Toyota picked it as the first sort of US cooperation exercise that they had, and within a year it became the best performing plant in the group. By anybody's standards, that's fast change. And again, arguably the purpose of NUMMI experiment was for Toyota to find out how to establish their production system outside of Japan, which they've since been able to do and expand across the planet. So in respect to the objective of NUMMI, it was a phenomenal success, even though it's might not be there today. But the way they did with that was they took the leadership team over to Japan, put them through amazing training, and gave them that a buddy beside them, one-on-one and one-on-two, and gave them an awful lot of coaching. They did what we saw in a meal slide. The mindset of the managers was to be beside the people, coaching them and developing their skills and helping them to form new beliefs about what good looks like. And by doing that, they managed to get that plant to change around in no time flat. So, change on a big scale across 3,000 people in a plant that's historically been failing is possible. And I know that from personal experience. I've done it with my clients. So, we have to really realize that culture emerges from leaders who focus on developing people first. That's it. And for leaders to do that, to focus on developing people first, in my mind and my view, I feel that leaders have to have an understanding of what makes people human. Okay, which is the way their brain works, and this isn't anything new. We've had these messages coming at us. We've just not had the open mind. I don't know what it is. It's the language, the vocabulary, or the construct of the anchoring points in the way we look at the world and the lens we look through the world with right now, to recognize what's being said. But I mean, if you go back to Fujio Cho, the CEO of Toyota from 1999 to 2005, he said you have to respect people's humanity, which is how they think and feel. I mean, crikey, it doesn't get much more obvious than that. He's telling us we have to understand how people think, what happens in their brains when they're thinking, what happens when they're having emotions, and how that makes them respond to everything: change, lean, training, managers, and why people leave because of managers. So, if we want to think about what goes there underneath the sort of the lean toolbox, the pills, the quick fix, the Toyota Kata sort of skills development based approach, we've really got to get into identifying culture as a neural and psychological issue. So there we go. Answer the question: how do we inject continuous improvement into the culture? The answer is, from my point of view at least, one brain at a time. I've obviously, like I say, spent 17 years looking into this stuff, all different types of disciplines around psychology, and as much as I can cram into my brain about neuroscience. And it seems to me that if we want to succeed like Toyota, do better in our lean efforts, do better in our change programs, that you have to get better at understanding human nature. So we explain this slide in more detail in our masterclass. Next one's coming up in January. And we go into how it all runs in all directions, as you can see with the little arrows linking them all together, and how all the wiring and chemical issues that play in our heads happen before we do anything, before we speak, before we act, and how this has to pass through the environment to another brain. So if you can understand more about that, then it really helps. And again, pictures speaking 1,000 words. We try and put that into images to help people focus on it. The masterclass is called Culture in Action, and we focus on the beliefs, thoughts, and feelings that lead to the action that's going on in people's brains, so we can really start to understand human nature at a deeper level. I'm at 41 minutes now, so I think we're about there. The next masterclass, if anybody's interested, is in Apeldoorn in the Netherlands on the 17th and 18th of January, and we'll dig into this subject a bit more and explain, what happens in people's heads in any environment you find yourself, with somebody else or 3,000 people like it did in me. I'm sure Tim will provide the link to that kind of stuff, the websites and the advertising for the masterclass, and any other materials. So anyone on the call, please feel free to join me on LinkedIn and ask any questions you've got now, and get in touch for anything else you might need after that. But that's about it for me, I think.
All right, thank you, David. And now's your opportunity to provide questions that you might have about his presentation, and we'll review any of them questions that we've had. Again, if you're interested in submitting a question, please submit on the right side of your screen. We do have one question here. You said culture isn't changed by the application of tools. In summary, what would you say does change culture?
I think we touched on it during the presentation. I need to come back to language again. The way the brain uses language to construct its worldview, and again, this is why if you put a Japanese person in a functional magnetic resonance imager to scan their brain, and give them a normal logical solution, like add 2 + 7, then you see that the right hemisphere of their brain lights up a lot more than a normal Western brain does, given the same challenge. So it shows that there's this sort of two-way effect, that culture affects the way brains grow, and the sensory stimulus that brains are exposed to all of their lives have a massive effect on the way brains process information. And also that the way language has a massive impact on that has to be taken into account. So kanji characters, obviously are pictograms. They present a picture, and there has to be a lot more interpretation to the way the language is constructed and interpreted. And that all features in the way you see Japanese brains working differently to Western brains. So it is really an interesting phenomena. But considering all of that, and then thinking about the fact that we've all got a limited language register, a limited vocabulary, based on the technical things that we're trained to do in our lives. So, I feel very fortunate that I've moved from engineering and sort of been a precision engineer and tool maker, working on medical equipment and bits and pieces, and design engineering, and managed to have broad experience through strategy development, but then spent all this time reading psychology and neuroscience as well. And that expansion of vocabulary has given me a totally different way to see the world. And it's that kind of realization that I think we can take on board and share with others. It's if we introduce new language around the way the brain works and the mind works, and keep it simple to start with, because it's like going to Gemba. You have to go to the place where people are comfortable with the language they currently have, and expand it slowly. So we can't be throwing all those big words I sort of mentioned in passing today too quickly. We need to build up to them. But if we can give people new language, it changes the way they frame the world, see the world, and interpret the world and what they're seeing in it. and that changes their wiring and firing pattern, i.e. their belief. And if you change somebody's belief, you change the way they behave and act in the world. And culture is a combination of all of that. So if you want to change culture, basically start thinking about language. Simple things, really, really simple things to start with, especially the psychology side of it. I mean, just the word should, that implies guilt. If you should have been here on time, and I've said that to you, Tim, then I'm making myself right and making you wrong. So there's a lot of psychology and a lot of blame and projection and all that kind of stuff to be understood about language as well. So so we can start simple, but it is a change of language that will be one of the biggest influences on a change of culture.
All right, great. We have another question came in. As we know, in the lean community, we have to set target conditions and clearly define future states if we're going to know how to close the gap. In the same way, one might have a definition of root cause analysis. Do you have a definition of culture?
Yeah, I do, and I get hammered for it by systems thinkers as well, because I've been a bit not careful enough with my wording around it. But yeah, culture being an emergent property of a number of different things. If you go back to Edgar Schein, you talk about artifacts and symbols and that kind of stuff. But yeah, the definition of culture that I offer is much more focused on beliefs and language and that kind of stuff. But yeah, and since I've been working with Emil, we've changed it very slightly, but we work with a strict definition of culture that everybody can work off of. So that, again, it's going back to standardization, lean principles. If you want everybody to be speaking and having the same understanding about something, speaking the same way about something, you've got to standardize it. So we've kind of standardized this, let's call it a working model for culture rather than a definition of culture. And by presenting that to people, we can make sure that everybody's on exactly the same page. And that's a huge thing to be able to achieve, that at least, get a senior executive team to be talking the same way and having the same meaning for the word culture is a huge step in the right direction. Because I think, in my experience in the last 10, 15 years, I've put that question to people quite often. When they say, oh, we've got a culture problem, I say, okay, that's interesting. Define culture. And nobody can. There isn't a working definition of culture that anybody can cite, other than it's the way we do things around here. And I think we need to get a little bit more technical about it than that. So yeah, the simple answer is yes. I've definitely got a working model of culture that uses very well considered language that we share with people to make sure they're all singing from the same hymn sheet.
All right, great. And I've got one more. Can you describe what a continuous improvement culture looks like?
Wow. Yeah, good question. I think let's go back to Toyota Way 2001 and those 5 key words. What we see, or what we've been told happens in Toyotas, and what we've seen at NUMI and the training that went on there is, the 50% of managers' time is sitting beside people coaching. It's helping people make those small step changes and improvements. It's sometimes, the whole idea of groups getting together and taking a lot of time out, it seems to be a Western construct. I'm not sure it's done the same way in Japan. Not at Toyota and not at many other of the successful Japanese companies. So I think for me, a continuous improvement culture, thinking about, I mean, the more accurate definition of the word Kaizen, let's introduce that for a second. I investigated that extensively many years ago. And the definition I've got now lodged in my brain is ongoing goodness and benefit for all, with no one person gaining at another's expense. That was the more accurate translation of Kaizen rather than continuous improvement that I got from a number of different indigenous Japanese people I checked it out with. And so, if you want to bring that across to sort of a Western, Christian-based sort of belief system, because there's a lot of influence in that principle and that philosophy behind Kaizen from Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism in the Shintoism approach to life that the Japanese adopt. And obviously religion has a huge impact on the way our brains are formed throughout our lives. So if you think about it, those words, ongoing goodness and benefit for all, with no one person gaining at the benefit of others kind of thing. That sounds a bit to me like ongoing goodness and benefit. Sorry, sounds a bit like do unto others, love thy neighbor, that kind of thing. So I think I'm trying to pre-qualify how I'm going to answer that question, which is a continuous improvement culture is one where people actually care for each other, where, rather than having 3 C's for concern, cause, countermeasure, you have 3 C's for care, compassion, and concern. It's about human beings interacting with each other and doing what's best as a social group. And I think we've missed that, under target pressures from ever increasing or decreasing timelines to deliver profit, and we've lost the humanity out of it all. And if you go back to Yoji Yakao, who was the founder of Hoshin Kanri, introduced that to Toyota in 1958, and he talks extensively about the respect for humanity in the philosophy that sits behind his approach to Hoshin Kanri, because Hoshin Kanri is all about making sure people are included and valuing their opinion and respecting them. So, yeah, a continuous improvement culture looks like an environment where people care for each other and there is inherent honesty, respect, and trust. Something like that.
All right, great. One other question, are there any books you'd recommend? I know you mentioned a couple, I think, in your presentation. I guess these books can either be regarding lean or building culture, or even some of the neuroscience that you mentioned.
Yeah, I think a book that really got me on the path to enjoying psychology, which is, I don't know, I found it pretty easy to read, and I'm sure it's been written very well. It's called I'm Okay, You're Okay. And that's a great place to start to understand a principle called transactional analysis, which is all about understanding that our parents have an influence over our brains as us when we were children. We have a child-based experience of the world in that sense, and those two things combine until we become an adult. So you end up with this principle of parent, adult, child, and we carry this trilogy of parts inside us is the principle, and we have to try and communicate as adult to adult, or parent to parent, or child to child, and quite often we don't. We talk parent down to child, especially in sort of leadership positions, and this is where we come back to language and should and implying guilt and being wrong and exercising power and all those kind of things that demotivate people. So yeah, that's a really good place to start, is I'm okay, you're okay. But that was a long time ago for me. The stuff I've read more recently is like Beyond the Zonules of Zin, which is a strange name for a book that's all about the neurons at the back of your eye where your brain starts. So that's a lot more technical, and I wouldn't recommend that one until you've been looking at this stuff for a while. I'll tell you what, not a book, Tim, but a website or a podcast that's really great to listen to is Dr. Ginger Campbell's Brain Science podcast. That's fantastic. I've learned a lot from that.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I forgot to mention, or there was a tail end of that question as well, like any books you'd recommend to sell this concept to a CEO? Would there be any more specific to that task?
The answer at the moment is no. Emil and I are writing our first. We're looking to help that link into a bigger project and write another one in a year or two's time when we've had a chance to apply this to a number of organisations and prove the theory in practice. But the honest answer is no. I don't know of any. If there's some out there, I'd be glad to hear about them. But as far as we know, we're kind of on the front end of combining psychology with lean and explaining it that way. But yeah, we're currently working on a book and hope to have that out in about 6 months. But that will be called CIA, Culture in Action.
Okay, great. We'll definitely look forward to that when it comes out. Well, and thank you everybody for all of your questions. And thank you, David, for a very insightful presentation. We'll be sending a recorded link for the webinar replay to each of you next week. This brings our webinar to a close. Our next scheduled webinar will be on Thursday, January 10th, entitled The O.C. Tanner Way, presented by David Siebert, Vice President and Value Stream Leader at O.C. Tanner. and you can find more information about that at ame.org/webinars to sign up. And please don't forget to fill out the short survey that'll be in your inbox. And thank you for attending, everybody, and happy holidays. Have a great day.
Thanks, cheerio.